The story that follows includes a description of an aeroplane in trouble. If you are a nervous flyer and either on a flight or about to board a flight, or even just thinking of flying at some point in the near future, you may want to listen to this story, jolly good fun though it is, at a different time. Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story, Flights of Fancy. When he noticed that the wing of the aeroplane was falling apart, Alan Biengo was not surprised. After all, he had pretty much predicted that it was going to happen. Even so, he was absolutely furious. Alan Biengo didn't have any conspicuous aptitude for divination, for all that on this one occasion his forecast had proved accurate. That was more a case of hedging his bets in the prophecy department. Predicting calamity when he was on an aeroplane, not merely one calamity but an abundance of calamity, was very much Alan's area of expertise, and a skill at which he had a great deal of practice because, being a sales executive for an international hotel chain, he travelled by air frequently. 2 or 3 times a week, usually. For Alan, every flight was an exercise in sustained creative premonition. As the plane taxied to the runway, he would visualise the possibility of a collision with another aircraft, probably one descending from the sky at considerable speed, and the likely impact it would have, literally and figuratively, the variable human loss that different points of impact would result in, the nature of the injuries sustained by passengers, and, importantly, quite how much it would hurt him personally. Once the meander to the runway was over, when the propellers started making that alarming whooshing noise and the plane began to shake and creak in its impulsive desire to leave the ground, he would count down in his head to the inevitability of death when things went wrong. He would assess the first bit of the runway with an optimistic, probably all right, but the rapidly gathering speed moved him swiftly onto probably not all right, then through certainly injured, to life-altering abrasions, considerably maimed, limbs missing, and so on until the plane took off and he arrived at definitely dead. Now that he was in the air, he knew that, technically, the most dangerous part of the flight was over, but that didn't mean that he could sit back and relax. On the contrary, this was the time for more vivid and complex speculation. He spent the first 20 minutes of every flight in mortal terror that the hold concealed a bomb triggered by atmospheric pressure. Having reached cruising altitude, this prospect could largely be discounted, though there was still the ongoing risk of an explosive activated by a timer. Did Alan put much faith in airport security? Did he hell? Then there was the ever-present danger of a head-on collision with another plane. Were the odds against it so very high when traffic always followed the same flight paths? Sure, there were people theoretically in control of which plane was flying where, but factor in human error and the unreliability of technology, and it all began to feel a bit flimsy. How about the possibility of 2 hefty birds simultaneously taking out both engines? Planes are designed to fly on a single engine, the internet said, which was only reassuring if you couldn't imagine 2 birds in the sky at the same time. A pretty straightforward task for an imagination working as hard as Alan's. What if the emergency exit was faulty and spontaneously fell off, sucking everyone in its vicinity out of the plane? Alan hated sitting by the emergency exit for this reason. But he also hated not sitting by the emergency exit in case there was an emergency that he couldn't escape because too many other people were in the way. He also hated anybody else sitting by the emergency exit because there was no guarantee that they wouldn't turn out to be some death-hungry mad person determined to open the thing mid-flight. Choosing seats on aeroplanes was a time-consuming process for Alan. Every potential hazard and possible jeopardy had to be mulled over and, importantly, pictured in full horrific detail, Alan playing every peril over and over in his head with cinematic detail and gruesome clarity. As with the takeoff routine, this lucidity included the specifics of harm and fatality, the nature of any wounds, the intensity of any pain, the protraction of any death, and of course the numbers involved. It was often easy to conclude that the number of casualties would be, well, everybody. There weren't many alternatives when a big metal object travelling at speed went wrong. But where he was able to exercise a great deal more invention was in the matter of pain and fear, which could range from almost comfortingly fleeting to agonising and drawn out. Worst of all was the dread that, at the highest cruising altitude, the aeroplane he was in would somehow disintegrate in such a way as to leave him not sufficiently wounded as to be unconscious when his body began its vulnerable descent to the earth, resulting in a lengthy period of abject terror as he anticipated the horrible death towards which he was hurtling. How long would it take to drop from, say, 42,000 feet? He knew very well that the official answer was 110 seconds. He knew this because he had looked it up on the internet. In fact, he had found a calculator that showed you the time it would take to fall from any height of his choosing, so he had a good idea of the fall time at every stage of a flight. But body shape did play a part, and it begged the question, which was better? Get yourself into a diving posture so the whole thing would be over with as swiftly as possible? Even so, it would be a distressingly drawn-out nearly 2 minutes, he reckoned. Or was it better to prolong the agony? Spread yourself out so as to resemble a sort of human parachute, then perhaps make a phone call or two. Might that result in faster falling bits of wreckage causing further injury? Might it, in fact, offer the potential to be knocked out or decapitated by a welcome bit of debris, a plummeting propeller blade or piece of luggage? He had never made up his mind, which he supposed was why they were questions he kept coming back to. But one thing of which he was certain, and which bothered him perhaps more than any other part of the scenario, was that it was bound to be really, really cold, wasn't it? Not merely biting, but absolutely unbearably freezing, at that height and falling at that speed. 2 minutes, give or take, of glacial Arctic chilliness. It just seemed the worst way to go. Sometimes he would keep his coat on during flights, though he knew that outside the plane it would make little difference. Inside the plane, naturally, it made him sweat profusely and endure an unnecessary level of discomfort for a great many hours longer than the hypothetical and hypothermic 2 minutes of falling from a height, but that was the problem with worrying, wasn't it? In some ways, the worrying was itself every bit as unpleasant, cumulatively at least, as the thing that was being worried about. Alan had considered this too, and for good measure he had spent some time worrying about the worrying. He had talked about it, occasionally to doctors and therapists, but also to friends with whom he was not embarrassed to share his fears. The doctors prescribed medication to relax him during flights, but he couldn't possibly use that because if he was relaxed, he wouldn't be equipped to deal with a disaster when it arose. The therapeutic advice varied, but was usually to do with controlling and containing the worrying, ideally so that it wasn't a feature of the flying itself, which was ridiculous because if he wasn't worrying about the flight, how would he be prepared for every eventuality? Friends had tried to persuade him that there was nothing to worry about. On the other hand, he was so persuasive about his fears that he had talked some of them into worrying about flying as much as he did, so when it came to who had the superior argument, it was a bit of a draw. His friend Tony, who was a life coach so presumably assumed herself extra qualified to hand out advice, told him that worrying was a prayer for something bad to happen. Alan was a mere sales representative, so his opinion lacked credentials. Nevertheless, he thought that it was piss-poor advice. "I don't want bad things to happen," he responded. "I worry because there is a possibility that they might." "An extremely slim possibility." "A possibility all the same." Tony had looked at him over her glass of wine, which, along with the pub surroundings, was the only thing reassuring him that she wasn't going to charge for this conversation, and pursed her lips disapprovingly. "Sometimes a possibility is too minuscule to be worth worrying about. If you're going to worry, Alan, worry about the things that are likely to cause you danger. Not flying. Statistically, you're more likely to get killed crossing the road." Ah, yes. Statistics. They were no help either. Statistics, Alan knew very well, said that flying was the safest form of travel. He was fully aware that, statistically, there was far more danger from air pollution than there was from air traffic, though, pedant that he was, he would be the first to point out that the two did rather go hand in hand. Having browsed the internet on the subject for hours, he also knew that, statistically, he had a greater chance of dying from food poisoning, or from falling off a ladder, or drowning in the bath, or indeed, when crossing the road. But how exactly was this supposed to reassure him when he was trapped 36,000 feet in the air in a metal tube hurtling at 14 kilometres per minute? Sitting on an actual flight, there was a precisely 0% chance of dying crossing the road. He supposed that, if he really went to the effort, he might manage to fall off a ladder or drown in a bath mid-flight, but even if he were to overcome the various obstacles in the way, he was sure that the fastidiously trained flight attendants would leap into action and rescue him. True, the risk of food poisoning remained a consideration, a not insubstantial one, given his experiences of aeroplane meals. So what, was that supposed to reassure him? It just gave him another thing to worry about, particularly as the people flying the plane got their food from the same source, so it seemed to him that before he had finished the harrowing experience of dying from food poisoning, there was every likelihood of being involved in a food poisoning-related crash when the pilot lurched over the controls in a sudden bout of botulism. Also, the statistics for travel safety are worked out per mile travelled, so he found them the opposite of reassuring when he considered quite how many miles he tended to get through on a plane, or when he considered that every mile travelled brought you that little bit closer to the kind of mileage that represented a threat, statistically speaking. A lot of miles was definitely part of the deal with flying. Otherwise, he would have been positively delighted to travel using a statistically more dangerous method. But he hadn't told Tony any of this. Instead, he had mildly informed her that, in fact, he did worry quite a lot about crossing the road too. But at least when crossing the road, I'm partly in control of what happens. So it's a problem of trust, she had concluded. Which, he was fully prepared to acknowledge, it was. While he was in an aeroplane, he had no control at all. Everything was in the hands of other people, people he couldn't even observe. He didn't much like being driven, but in a car he could see what his driver was doing and offer advice and point out things they might have missed. Ironically, he would have felt safer on an aeroplane if he was allowed to sit at the controls himself, though he knew that everyone else on the flight would be unlikely to benefit from the same feeling of security. "You can go through life worrying about everything, Alan," Tony had said. "Thank you," he responded. "I shall." "Fine," she snapped, draining her glass. "Now get me another wine, or I shall have to charge you for this conversation." It wasn't that he resented this well-meaning counsel. It was just that he had been through it all already. If there was something obvious to be said about air travel, he had heard it, read it, probably said it himself. He had done his research with the kind of obsessive scrutiny that only somebody as afraid of flying as he was would deploy. To some extent, he relied upon this knowledge to get him through each flight. The worrying might have been irrational, but it wasn't as if he was refusing to get onto planes at all. While he was in the sky, as he saw his aeroplane spinning out of control or breaking up or spontaneously exploding and spitting him into a dreadful descent of conscious agonizing fear, he repeated the mantras that he had learned. That air was statistically the safest form of travel, that he had more to worry about when he was in the bath, that insert the name of the airline he was travelling with hadn't had an accident since insert the date which he would have meticulously researched prior to flying. He combated his irrational flights of imagination with facts. He tried to drown out the thoughts of impending disaster with sensible arguments and reasoned optimism. He was not very successful, but perhaps his efforts to maintain a tug-of-war between delusion and reason were what enabled him to step onto aeroplanes at all, and to give the appearance, a little gripping of armrests aside, of a regular, unconcerned passenger. So, while one part of his brain was pondering what would happen if the tail fin dropped off, another part of his brain was saying, "When did you last hear about a tail fin dropping off a plane? Never. That's because it doesn't happen." He would let the consequences play out in his head all the same, but the logical corrective enabled him to stay seated with a nonchalant look on his face, as if he were simply pondering the drinks menu. Or, if he was seated by the window, he hated being seated by the window because of the additional stimulus it provided his imagination, but he also hated not being seated by the window because he wanted to be the first to know if something went wrong. He might be looking at the wing and wondering, if it started to disintegrate, how fast would it happen, and whether there would be time for the pilot to make an emergency landing before the rest of the plane was torn apart, and the logical side of his brain would step in with facts about how thoroughly aviation companies stress test aircraft, and he would again remind himself that aeroplane wings just don't fall apart. It doesn't happen. It isn't a thing. And frankly, his brain would add, given how unlikely it is that it would happen at all, imagine how much more improbable it is that it will happen while you're staring at the wing and imagining it happening. Which is why he was so furious when it did happen. He had predicted that it was going to happen, and therefore felt it should have remained well beyond the realms of possibility. He was also furious that the other thing he had imagined countless times, which was how he would react to this kind of crisis, that is, by leaping into action and doing everything he could to save, if not the whole aircraft, then certainly himself, didn't happen. He was alerted to the problem by a loud vibration, which wasn't the sort of noise aeroplanes were supposed to make. Alan was incredibly sensitive towards the subtlest changes of sound in a flight, and this one was definitely new to him. He looked out of the window to see that one of the slats on the wing had started to splinter, but instead of alerting a member of the crew, shouting for help, applying the kind of split-second emergency timing for which he had been preparing himself all of these years, he just sat and stared at it. Was it disbelief? No, not really. He absolutely believed what he was seeing. Nor was he frozen by fear or shock. If anything, he felt oddly calm, almost relieved that after all this time worrying, the bad thing was happening at last. But in spite of his fury and the certainty that this was definitely the end for all on board, Alan found himself questioning whether it was appropriate to cause a fuss. Was it really as serious as it appeared? Or would he look silly if he drew attention to it? Was it worth waiting to see how things developed before creating a scene that might, after all, be unnecessary? Somebody else would notice, and they could be the one to make a fuss. Or probably somebody else had already noticed and decided that it wasn't important, which meant that he ought to ignore it as well. Larger pieces splintered off the slat. It was the leading edge of the wing, which meant that it was liable to affect the pilot's control. Yes, Alan was sufficiently self-educated to have a shrewd understanding of how this deficiency would impact an aircraft. Alan felt a tap on his arm. It was the passenger next to him, a lady with a neat bob and a face that was almost completely white. One of her hands continued to reflexively tap his arm, though she wasn't looking at him, too transfixed by the view of the disintegrating wing. "Do you think that might be a problem?" she whispered. "Or should we, I don't know, tell someone?" He flashed her a sickly smile. She was still staring through the window, so this was more for his own benefit than hers. "Oh, I expect it's fine," he heard himself saying, even as his brain was screaming, "Of course it's not bloody fine!" and another piece of detritus flew past the window. "But maybe, I don't know, should we say something?" "I expect we should," she agreed tentatively. "Should we?" The noise got louder, and the plane began to shake violently. "Well, I suppose I'll tell someone then," said Alan, and he put his hand in the air like a schoolboy about to attempt a maths question he hadn't really understood. "If you push this," the lady suggested, pointing out the button that was there to summon assistance, as Alan was more than aware. "Of course," said Alan, annoyed that the lady wasn't prepared to push her own button if she was so clever. But he pushed his, then said, "I didn't know that, actually. I have flown before." The plane lurched in a way that Alan knew was caused by the leading edge of one wing being less comprehensive than it was supposed to be. The area around the slat had also started to tear. An air stewardess approached with the fixed, helpful grin cultivated by cabin crew the world over. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. "We're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die," screamed Alan's brain. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "We were chatting, me and... sorry, I don't know your name." He grinned stupidly at Bob Lady, who grinned stupidly back. "Anyway," he continued, once sufficient time had passed to let her offer her name, and since she hadn't, it was not impolite to carry on talking, "we were chatting and wondering, whether that," he indicated the damaged section, "is meant to be like that, or—" The stewardess peered through the window. "Oh," she said, frowning. Then she added, "Oh my God," before attempting to reanimate the fixed grin. "Let me check with the pilot," she said. Then she broke into a run, disappearing behind the curtain into business class with a swoosh. The plane was juddering and shaking quite a lot now, and the noise was so loud that Alan could barely hear himself think. There was a friendly ping, and the seatbelt lights came on, flickering unsteadily in exactly the way they would in a disaster movie. "The seatbelt light has come on," announced the pilot, indistinctly, and a little unnecessarily, over the noise. "Please return to your seats, as we're going to be making an emergency landing." "I guess they'll need that wing to land this thing properly," Alan commented to nobody in particular, and Bob Lady began to weep. Even though there was shrapnel shredding from the wing, and the plane was rocking as if held by the fist of a giant child trying to shake it to pieces, Alan found that he was strangely undaunted, but that, once again, he was angry. This was stupid, a bloody stupid way to die, and how utterly, predictably ridiculous that he had seen the whole thing coming, that he had envisaged something so completely unlikely, and it had only gone and happened. If the universe could throw that at him, then he was better off dead, because the universe was a dick. Then he remembered what Tony had told him, that worrying was a prayer for something bad to happen, and his blood ran cold. Had the universe thrown this at him because he had effectively begged it to? Was this all his fault? It was a ludicrous idea, but no more ludicrous than the situation in which he found himself. Perhaps anyone facing death like this becomes superstitious. The staunchest atheist might discover God, the lapsed churchgoer become devout, the outspoken rationalist appeal to the supernatural. Who wouldn't grasp at any last hope, any chance? Or perhaps not. Maybe a great many people remain true to their principles and give in to sheer panic. But in Alan's case, he was suddenly convinced that everything that was happening, the disintegrating wing, the trembling plane, and the inevitable gory death towards which they were heading, was his fault. He shouldn't have been such a damn fool as to imagine it, but having imagined it so persistently, he had finally been rewarded with what he'd been asking for all along. He was to blame. He looked at the weeping passenger next to him, her lips moving in some repeated, terrified mantra. He glanced further along the row and met pale, frightened faces all around, heads shaking in disbelief, couples clutching each other's hands while mouthing words of hopeless comfort. He heard a baby's screams, all but drowned out by the deafening throbbing. And he felt guilty. Every one of these poor people about to die, because he had been willing it to happen. All right, he thought. I created this mess, so I can jolly well clear it up. And he made a decision to believe absolutely that the plane was going to make it. He exercised his imagination with the same energy that had preoccupied it previously, but made a concerted effort to point it in the opposite direction. So the leading edge of the wing was a bit tattered, but the basic outline of the wing was still there, and that's all the pilot needed to achieve a perfectly safe emergency landing. Oh, there would be loss of control, but you know how highly trained these pilots are. The simulators they sit in to practice getting through the most hazardous scenarios. This would be a walk in the park. Sure, the plane was shaking as if to rattle itself to bits. That's what they are designed to do. He had been in turbulence worse than this. They were all going to be fine. This was fine. Absolutely fine. Fine. A warm glow spread from the depths of his heart and through his entire body. There was no need to worry, and there never had been. Leave it to the experts, the ones who design the planes, the ones who build the planes, the ones who set the regulations and test the planes. Admittedly, whoever designed or built the leading edge of the wing slats had done a pretty shonky job, but that made it all the more likely that the others had been on form. The shuddering calmed down, and for a moment it almost felt as though normal flight had resumed. As the horrific noise relented, Alan could suddenly hear what the lady next to him was saying to herself over and over again. "It's all my fault. It's all my fault." The plane lurched, and the noise resumed. "What are you saying?" yelled Alan. The lady looked at him, wide-eyed with panic. "Why do you think it's your fault?" "I made this happen," she shouted back, her eyes glistening. "I imagined the wing might... I was watching, and it was me, my worrying. That's what did it." Alan gazed at her in horror. "I'm so sorry," she cried. His mind was working fast. If he hadn't been the only one praying for something bad to happen, then he couldn't save the situation on his own. The universe wasn't going to gift him a happy outcome, not if he was battling the worry of another passenger. "You have to stop worrying," he bellowed. "It's too late," she bellowed back. "No, it isn't," he insisted. "We can turn this around. All we need to do is..." He began to address the whole plane, realising that there was bound to be a lot of worrying going on. "Believe! We need to believe that this is all going to be fine." "I can't!" she screamed. "Yes, you can!" In spite of the shaking and the seatbelt sign, he ripped open the clasp holding him in place and stood to declaim more easily. "Think of the experts who designed the plane, the experts flying it now. This is nothing to them. We're going to be all right." "Are you sure?" a man with a sweaty moustache asked doubtfully. "Surer than I've ever been about anything. If we can imagine an unlikely disaster, then we can easily imagine a likely triumph." "That makes sense," the man agreed. "Good! So say it! We're going to be fine." "We're going to be fine." "All of you, repeat it! We're going to be fine!" The passengers looked at each other uncertainly, then back at Alan, then obediently repeated his words. He was gratified to see a few relieved smiles. "And keep saying it," he ordered, before running into the next section of the plane. "Sir, you need to remain in your..." began the crying stewardess, but he interrupted her. "No, I don't. And do you know why not? Because we are as safe as anybody in the world could ever hope to be." "But the shaking..." "The shaking is exactly what this aeroplane is designed to do. Think about it." The passengers in the section were leaning towards him, eager for reassurance. "Now, say after me. We're going to be fine." The words, "We're going to be fine," echoed from one section of the plane to the next, and Alan carried on running between the rows of seats, coaxing hope from the passengers, even as they tilted into a shuddering dive. "We're heading for the ground!" screamed an elderly lady. "Of course we're heading for the ground! That's where we want to be, isn't it?" yelled Alan with a manic grin. "Come on, have faith in the 1,500 hours of flight time a pilot needs before they're allowed to work for an airline! We're going to be fine! Say it!" As he reached the front of the plane, Alan was handed a microphone by one of the cabin crew, and with the fervour of an evangelist, he made his announcement. "Let's hear it from everyone! We're going to be fine! We're going to be fine!" parroted the passengers. "Let's hear it from the back section. We're going to be fine! We're going to be fine! Now from business class. We're going to be fine! And once more with feeling!" Cheers broke out as Alan led them in the call and response. Passengers beamed and laughed as the craft shrieked its way out of the clouds and dived towards the runway that had been cleared for it. "I want you to think about what you're going to do this evening," Alan enthused. "Think about the people you're going to call, the bottle of wine you're going to open, the plans you're going to make for tomorrow." Alan's words were so compelling and the response so effusive that the travellers barely noticed the ground rushing towards them. There wasn't a single eye on the large chunks crumbling from the aircraft and leaving an increasingly stubby excuse for a wing. Not one stomach lurched as the wheels made contact with the ground, even when the plane wobbled hazardously and the intact wing scraped the runway, sending a shower of sparks into the air. As they heaved and juddered their way to a noisy, ungainly halt, there was only elation and celebration. Before they had fully stopped, even though the seatbelt signs were very deliberately on, the click, click, click of passengers freeing themselves rebounded from row to row, and they stood and embraced each other and wept tears of sheer joy. Those who were near him rushed forward to embrace Alan, whose inspirational words had seen them through what should have been the most terrifying ordeal of their lives, but which, after all, was simply an ordinary emergency landing with half a wing missing. Alan found himself in the middle of a sticky, heaving group hug, and his heart was fuller than he had ever known it. He was the last to leave. Once the emergency exits had been activated, and everyone leapt joyously into the inflatable slides that pretty much made being in a near-tragic disaster worth it, the stewardess gripped his shoulder. "That was amazing," she said. "You're amazing." "I'm really not," he modestly responded. "I did nothing at all." "Anyway, the captain's going to want to speak with you," she told him. So he waited as the plane emptied, and when the last passenger had jumped onto the slide with a happy whoop, a smartly dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard emerged from the cockpit, followed by an equally smart woman with peroxide blonde hair and vivid makeup. They both wore hats, which is how Alan knew they were pilots. "I gather we've got you to thank for our safe landing," the man said. "We've got your expert flying to thank for that," Alan laughed, and the man grinned awkwardly and pointed at the woman. "You mean my expert flying?" she said dryly. "A man's voice told us the seatbelt light was on," explained Alan apologetically, "so I assumed—" "I do the announcements," explained the man. "Makes people feel safer. I do the flying," added the woman. "Well, excellent job," Alan said. "Really, never doubted you for a minute." "Couldn't have done it without you," she replied, flashing him a tight smile. "I'm pretty sure you could have," said Alan, who liked being the hero of the situation but was capable of a little perspective now that they were on the ground. The two pilots exchanged a glance. "Actually," the man began. "Let's be realistic," she interrupted. "That was some speech you made. Before that, I was convinced we were going down. We all were." The co-pilot nodded. "Until you persuaded us that we'd be fine, there was nothing keeping this plane up at all." "Well, except the wings," laughed Alan. "The wings?" repeated the captain in disbelief. "Plural? Is that a joke?" I expect it's pretty normal for an expert pilot to land with half a wing missing." Even as Alan said it, he started to doubt himself. That didn't sound right, did it? The co-pilot looked hesitantly at his captain, and she nodded. "Actually, even 2 complete wings won't keep a plane up by themselves," he said. "Obviously they make it a lot easier for people to have confidence in it working, but without the belief of the people inside, we haven't got a chance." "What are you saying? That aeroplanes are kept in the air by—" "Faith," the captain finished. "That's what keeps them in the air." "No, that's not—" Alan faltered. "I mean, I've read about— we all know there's all sorts of science and stuff that keeps aeroplanes in the air." "There is," agreed the co-pilot. "There's lots of science and aerodynamics, brilliant things like that. But it's mostly faith." "The aerodynamics are a decent backup," the captain explained, "but it's the faith that makes everything work." Alan blinked. It made complete sense, of course, but it was strange to hear it from actual pilots. "Why isn't this more widely known?" he asked. "Can you imagine?" she laughed. "Nobody would ever get on a plane again." "It's always worked by, people thinking the wings and the engines and the science is keeping them safe," said the co-pilot. "That's why it's such a clever design. And why losing a wing is normally a complete disaster. We shouldn't have been able to walk away from this. But you persuaded everyone that we could stay in the air. I don't know what inspired you, but you turned the whole situation around. One minute we were plummeting, the next we were making the most graceful landing any plane could make, wings or not." The captain nodded in agreement. "I barely had to touch the controls." The co-pilot impulsively gripped Alan in a firm embrace. Not to be left out, the captain gripped him from the other side, sandwiching him between them. "You saved our lives," she whispered. He shivered, partly at the realization that it was true, but also because her grip and her whispering, and the musty smell of her hard-working deodorant, were ever so slightly erotic. As a child, Alan had been fond of fiction that saw young people thrown into adventures which invariably ended with them rescuing the Prime Minister or foiling a plot to steal the crown jewels and being rewarded with a special reception in their honour. So when he received an invitation from the airline, saying that he was to attend a meal to acknowledge heroic actions that had saved 196 lives, he was unsurprised. He didn't even begin to suspect that there might be any ulterior purpose for the occasion until the second course had been served. All of the guests were extremely important people from the airline's board of directors. He was introduced to characters wielding various initials, a CFO, a CIO, even a COO, on being introduced to whom he wanted to exclaim "Coo!" But the COO seemed like a serious man, and Alan was wary of blotting his copybook, so he kept the witty ejaculation to himself. During dinner he was seated between a CEO and a president, who he imagined were probably the most important guests of all, apart from, presumably, himself. He was tucking into a saddle of aged hogget and wondering exactly what a hogget was, when the CEO lifted his Cote de Rhone and, swilling it around the glass with a thoughtful look, casually said to Alan, "I gather that the pilots on your eventful flight told you one or two little trade secrets." Trade secrets? He was briefly confused before the obvious trade secret came back to him. "Oh, you mean about the—" "Yes, that," the CEO hurriedly affirmed. "Indeed," added the President. "Should they not have told me?" "Not really," said the CEO, sipping his wine and adding, "Oh, that's terrific, isn't it?" "Very well balanced," agreed the President. "No, trade secrets are, as the name suggests, generally felt to be best left, if at all possible, secret." "Oh dear," said Alan. "I do hope they didn't get into any trouble." "Not a bit," smiled the CEO, with a dismissive wave. "I expect they'll just be sent on a course or something." "It's not a problem," the President went on. "We're sure you're trustworthy." He stared at Alan intensely. "Are you trustworthy?" Alan realised that the buzz of conversation had stopped, and all of the other directors around the table were focusing on him equally intensely. That was the moment when he began to suspect that there was more to the occasion than a simple gesture of thanks. He swallowed and nodded. "Very trustworthy," he informed the general company. The President relaxed, and the others followed suit. "I knew you were," he said. "More wine?" "Just needed to be sure that you won't be circulating any unhelpful information," the CEO said. As a waiter refilled Alan's glass, though it hadn't really needed refilling, the CEO withdrew a sheaf of papers from his jacket and carelessly put them on the table. Then he took an expensive-looking fountain pen from his breast pocket and popped it on top. Alan glanced at them uncertainly, then returned his attention to his hogget. Then he looked up, since the conversation seemed to have lulled again, and none of the directors seemed interested in their hogget. "No hurry," said the President with a nonchalant sniff. "But if you wouldn't mind at some point in the evening—" "Oh, you want me to sign something?" Alan realised, the penny finally dropping that the reception definitely had an underlying purpose beyond honouring him. "It formalises what we see as being trade secrets, vis-à-vis the science behind flight and—" "Though it's not science, is it?" "I don't think Mr. Biengo needs any of this explaining to him," the CEO cut in. "It's only a little signature. You don't mind, do you?" "I don't mind," said Alan, "though it isn't necessary. I meant it when I told you that I'm trustworthy." "We know you're trustworthy," chuckled the President, slapping him on the back. "That's how we know you won't mind giving us a signature." "You don't need my signature to be able to trust me, is my point." "Of course we don't," said the CEO, beaming. "That's why we didn't feel there was any problem asking for it." Given his already noted tendency to worry about pretty much anything, it is unsurprising that Alan was finding the papers rather concerning. The room had started to feel oppressive, and the directors were reminding him of the nightmarish scene in Mary Poppins in which George Banks is summoned before his employers. Alan wondered if a little diversity might have alleviated that impression. The apprehension must have shown on his face, because the President leaned over conspiratorially and told him,
"Not that you need it, but there's a bit of a sweetener as well."
"You mean pudding?"
laughed the President. "Very droll, yes. Pudding, what?"
"Not pudding," clarified the CEO. "Something more akin to a job offer." "A job offer? What sort of job?"
"Well, now."
The President leaned back in his chair, serious all of a sudden.
"I don't know if you've noticed, but flying has a bit of an image problem right now."
"It does?"
"It does."
"You fly frequently, yes?" Alan had explained all about his work as a sales executive, so the CEO's question was rhetorical. "What have you noticed about turbulence?" "Oh, I know about that," Alan answered, pleased to at last have a response that didn't make him look confused or stupid. "That's to do with climate change. The temperature difference between warm and cold air masses is widening, which leads to more clear air turbulence, and that's harder for pilots to predict, so—" Alan tailed off as he realised both the CEO and the President were chuckling.
"One of yours, Monty,"
the President said, and the man who had been introduced to Alan as the CMO smirked.
"I blame this woke latte-drinking generation, always on their phones," opined the CEO. "They won't believe anything they're told, will they? Constantly looking things up." "When aeroplanes were invented, people just accepted that they worked," said the President. "Now everyone wants an explanation. And of course, if we were to give them the explanation, the real one, they wouldn't have it, would they?"
"Wouldn't they?"
"Course they wouldn't,"
snapped the President.
"Faith isn't fashionable."
"That's why we had to invent all the science. Aerodynamics, angles of elevation, all that malarkey. Don't understand it myself, but why on earth should I? It's all nonsense anyway."
"We've worked very hard," continued the President, "getting all this science, so to speak, into schools and universities, circulating it so that when people want explanations there are some available. Decades of careful planning went into that. And now," he raised his voice, briefly enraged, "they've started to doubt all of that as well."
"Ha!" the CEO snorted into his glass. "Snowflakes!"
"There's this utter selfish greed for information, where once people said, 'How wonderful this thing flies,' now people say, 'But why does it fly, and how dependable is it, and what are the chances of it not flying?' Which is a bit of a disaster if planes are to stay in the air."
"It's a vicious cycle, isn't it?" the CEO said. "People doubt, so the plane wobbles. Plane wobbles, and people doubt some more. So it wobbles some more. Then people—"
"Mr. Biengo doesn't need the nature of a vicious cycle explained to him," the President interrupted. "Get to the point."
"The point is simply this. You appear to be a rather reassuring presence on a flight, Mr. Biengo."
"Marvellously reassuring,"
agreed the President, and a murmur of agreement went round the table. "So we feel that if you were willing to fly with us regularly, and if we were able to let it be known that you were on board our aeroplanes, our passengers might, on the whole, have more faith in flights reaching their destinations."
"You're quite the hero, after all."
Alan let this sink in. Could his presence make that much difference? Were they really proposing to employ him simply to sit on planes? "It would mean a lot of flying, of course."
2 or 3 times a week, perhaps?"
That was a lot of flying, and Alan was not a great fan of flying. On the other hand, his job already involved him flying 2 or 3 times a week, and that wasn't even the bit he got paid for. "I think you'll find the terms extremely generous."
"And we'd put you in the most expensive seats."
"And we'd fly you to some wonderful places."
"All expenses paid, naturally."
"Plus a generous benefits package, use of the gym and so on." Alan thought about it. No, he didn't much like flying, But if he had to fly to earn a living, it would be a great deal more fun to do it without having to be a sales executive as well.
"As I said, no hurry," said the CEO. "Maybe have a look after pudding."
"Ah, pudding," said the President with a greedy chortle.
"Eton mess, I believe. Talk about a sweetener."
As conversation resumed, Alan smiled to himself, feeling more confident in the future than he had for quite some time. He did not need to wait until after pudding to make his decision. He took to his new job like a natural. Not that it required any skill. Even so, he liked to think that he was bringing his own unique flair to it, not to mention the qualities he had honed in his many years as a sales executive. Alan would board each flight before the other passengers, waved through ostentatiously so that they could get a good, reassuring look at him. He grew to adore this moment, the way people broke into relieved smiles as they realised who was going to be on their journey. "That's Alan Biengo," they would exclaim, parents pointing him out to their children, partners happily nudging each other. Phones were held up for surreptitious, or less surreptitious, photos. He became a bit of an internet trope, his face appearing on social media posts under captions like, "Guess who's on our flight?" and "At least this plane isn't going to crash," and "Do your worst, turbulence." There was no expectation that he would do more than sit in his designated seat, but he felt that the least he could do was let everyone see him as they boarded. When people squeezed through first class on the way to cheaper, less comfortable seats, he would say hello, smile at the elderly in the least threatening way he could, playfully put children on his lap. He let teenagers take selfies with him, and he fist-bumped those who looked as though they moved in trendier circles. Former sales executive that he was an excellent judge when it came to putting people at ease, and everyone was delighted to receive his attention. He had time to relax during the flight, to watch films or do his crossword. He had never previously indulged in the free alcoholic drinks with which airlines ply their customers. His anxiety had resulted in a frankly Presbyterian approach to spirits, lest his all-important ability to respond to a disaster be dulled. But he found that he now had complete faith in aeroplanes staying safely in the air. Indeed, that a few glasses of fizz made that faith even easier to sustain. So he tended to enjoy quite a lot of it. Still, he took the time to stroll up and down the aisles every now and then, reaffirming his presence on the flight, checking on how people were doing, telling jokes to the children, and swapping sightseeing tips with the grown-ups. He even led passengers in a sing-song on 1 or 2 occasions. The airline, meanwhile, was subtly putting it about that he was travelling with them a lot. They started pulling the curtains round a first-class booth on every flight, so that passengers could imagine he was inside it, which he was perfectly happy for them to do. But if he was on a flight, he had decided he was going to earn his money and make it the best flight possible for everyone concerned. Cabin crews loved having him on board. When Alan Biengo was on a plane, they knew they wouldn't have to deal with difficult customers or crying babies, or people locking themselves into the toilets for one reason or another. They also needn't fear anything untoward happening to the plane itself. Though such was the power of faith inspired by even the possibility of Alan's presence, that the airline's flights were pretty free from jeopardy all round. They began a record run of safety, a period in which even turbulence all but disappeared from the flying experience. When other airlines realised this, they asked whether they might start pretending that Alan was flying with them as well. At first, Alan's airline were reluctant to entertain this idea. However, Alan persuaded them that safe flights, regardless of provider, all contributed to people's faith in flying full stop, so everyone was a winner. Eventually, it was agreed that, as long as Alan didn't actually fly with different airlines, for a not insubstantial fee they could say that he might. Alan, who benefited from a percentage of the licensing of his personality, began to rake in an impressive salary, most of which he was able to save because for much of any given week he was living in luxury at the expense of the airline. Whilst enjoying the best hotels, first-rate food, and the kind of perks thrown at people with his celebrity status, he visited the pyramids of Egypt, the Parthenon of Greece, the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu, the spectacular scenery of the Grand Canyon, the glaciers, mountains, and fjords of Norway, the Great Barrier Reef and the Valley of the Kings. He hadn't completely eliminated his anxieties. The places he visited stimulated all kinds of new worries, such as the possibility of encountering poisonous spiders, earthquakes, and tornadoes. And at a basic level, he found he was often too hot, or that the toilets were an unnerving shape. But it was worth it, he realised, to be able to discover that the world that he lived in was so startlingly beautiful, full of wonderful sights and experiences, and so historically and culturally fascinating. It was also a darn sight more interesting than being a sales executive. Then, one day, he was on a flight between Portugal and the Azores, and after a pleasant chat with a nice family about the picturesque Miradoros of Lisbon and the geological formations they might expect to see when they landed, he encountered a bit of a bottleneck on the way back to his seat. While he waited for it to clear, he found himself gazing out of the window. Perhaps he had enjoyed one too many glasses of complimentary champagne, or had simply become a bit blasé about the whole routine, but he found that he was looking properly at what was outside for the first time in a while. He saw the layer of clouds below the plane, and through the gaps in the clouds, the sunlight glistening off the sea some considerable distance below. He was struck by the enormity of the height at which they were flying. He was suddenly aware that he was in a big metal tube held up only by faith. He was immediately certain that death was imminent. The aeroplane lurched, an abrupt onslaught of turbulence throwing people out of their seats. Everything started shuddering, and the engines began shrieking as the craft dipped forward into a terrifying nosedive. "We're going to be fine!" shouted Alan, realising the stupidity of what he had done. All around him passengers were screaming, moving their lips in desperate, tearful prayers or curses. Babies were crying, children were vomiting, at least 3 people had headed straight for the toilets to have what they assumed would be a final cigarette. "We're going to be fine," he repeated, putting all of his effort into sounding convinced. "Are you sure?" asked a young lady, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Am I sure?" He laughed wildly. "Ha ha ha! Look around you! We're in the safest place that we could possibly be, statistically. Think of the skill of the people who made this aeroplane, who tested this aeroplane, who fly this aeroplane." "I guess," she said. "Then say it," he yelled in her face. "Repeat after me. We're going to be fine." "What the fuck was that?" asked the ashen-faced pilot as Alan sheepishly made his way to the exit. The other passengers had left, a mixture of fear and relief written on their faces. Alan hadn't received any hero's reception, for all that he had saved another plane. The pilot looked properly pissed off. "Sorry," said Alan. "It won't happen again." But it did happen again. It wasn't really Alan's fault, but a seed of doubt had been sown. As he greeted passengers on his next flight, a lady, gripping the hand of a tiny girl, looked at him apprehensively and asked, "Is this one going to be all right, then?" "Is it going to be all right?" responded Alan, laughing too loudly. "Why would you even ask the question? Look around you. Think about the skill that went into—" Evidently word had got out about the previous incident. The internet had done its thing. People had seen mobile phone videos of the near-death experience with Alan sitting right in the middle of it, and faith in the aeroplane's ability to stay in the air had been severely dented. What followed was the most turbulent flight Alan had ever been on, though he fought the waves of nausea and worked doubly hard to persuade everyone that they were going to be fine. Alan was not on the other aeroplanes flying in the wake of this wave of distrust, so when those aircraft hit turbulence, he wasn't there to assuage any doubts. Probably inevitably, it was those aeroplanes that started to drop out of the sky, or sometimes fall apart altogether. As the airline's CEO had pointed out, it was a vicious cycle. Once people saw that aeroplanes were crashing, they began to believe that this was the likely outcome of any flight they were on themselves. They were generally proved right. Alan continued to work as hard as he could, even though this required willful suspension of disbelief given the now routinely bumpy nature of flying. But the few aeroplanes he was able to steer to safety couldn't make much of an impact on the general perception of what was becoming a pretty overbearing trend. Before long, tragic air disasters became the norm. There were lawsuits, and although airline providers had comprehensively protected themselves from victims, and aviation companies had comprehensively protected themselves from airline providers, a few of them were slapped with hefty fines for getting their legal wording a bit wrong. Several CEOs decided it was time to retire before they were involuntarily made not quite so rich, and once insurers grew wise to the situation, it didn't take them long, manufacturers realised that however cheaply they put together their aeroplanes, it still wasn't going to be cheap enough to ensure much of a return before they fell apart mid-air. Before long, the only flights remaining were private jets, which remained safe because they were held up not by faith, but by entitlement. Some parts of the media tried to point the blame at Alan, but you could tell their heart wasn't in it. Yes, it was usual to try to blame somebody for a thing as momentous as the end of commercial air travel, but since faith of every kind had been gradually dying out anyway, it was ultimately accepted that the writing had been on the wall for a while. Alan wasn't bothered. The opposite, in fact. He felt vindicated. The friends who had told him that there was nothing to worry about were shamefaced to discover that there had been all along, and the ones who had been persuaded by his pessimism thanked him profusely for the warning. "You remember I told you that worrying's a prayer for something bad to happen," said Tony, the life coach, when they next caught up over a drink. "I do indeed," he confirmed. "You sure as hell got your answer." Since he didn't consider this any kind of life coaching, but merely a snarky insult, he let her buy the next round. What he didn't tell her was that he also thought it was a piss-poor analysis of the situation. Had bad things happened? Some aeroplanes had dropped out of the sky, and the aviation industry had died overnight. So, yes, some people had been killed rather horribly, and a lot of others had become unemployed. But in the long term, was this a bad thing? He reasoned that it was an excellent outcome for the environment, and the improved air quality over the following months confirmed this view. He also reasoned that he would never have to get on an aeroplane again, which saw a vast improvement in his mental health and blood pressure. Sure, it now took a great deal longer to get to the further corners of the globe, and, due to the expense of being at sea for days on end, such travel was restricted to those who were at least moderately rich. But Alan wasn't considering doing that anyway, what with his chronic fear of drowning. In any case, he felt it was time to explore destinations closer to home. Which is what he did. Using his airline earnings, he set off on a series of trips within the country and, enjoying the improved air quality and clear skies free from vapour trails, discovered that it was startlingly beautiful, full of wonderful sights and experiences, historically and culturally fascinating, and not even as wet as he had expected. Unlike other parts of the world, it didn't get too hot, and there was little risk of encountering poisonous spiders, earthquakes, and tornadoes. Great Britain, he concluded, was the perfect holiday destination. Who needs aeroplanes? He frequently asked himself cheerfully. This, it must be said, was a rather selfish perspective, given that it only applied to those who were already on British soil. But as a sales executive he had dealt almost exclusively with hotels catering for British tourists, so perhaps he had forgotten that people from other countries liked to go on holiday as well. Alan was not a stupid man, and he knew that his airline money would run out eventually. He also had over 20 years' experience as a sales executive for a hotel chain. Either he would end up working as a sales executive again, or he could use his money and experience to build his own empire of British hotels. There was plenty of new demand, after all, and he might as well get in there before anyone else. He drew up a comprehensive business plan before taking action. He had to know how realistic the idea was. As it turned out, it was not only realistic, but pretty darn brilliant, and it wasn't long before he had investors lining up to get involved too. He also asked Tony about it, but she seemed a bit put out that he had managed to arrive at such a sensible and ambitious life plan without any qualified life coaching, so didn't have much to say. Other friends offered encouragement, though, and he set out on this new adventure a happier, better balanced human being than he had been in a long time. That's not to say that there weren't worries. It was a big investment after all. but for once, the worries were in proportion to the risks. Sadly, before he could see the project through to completion, he was hit by a Vauxhall Corsa when he was crossing the road about half a mile from his house. The driver was doing 46 miles per hour in a 30-mile-an-hour limit, though Alan was looking at his phone when it happened, so there was probably fault on both sides. He was thrown several feet in the air, his head impacted the road at speed, and he never recovered consciousness. By the time the emergency services arrived, he had stopped breathing and, in spite of the best efforts of members of the public and the ambulance crew, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Everybody who knew Alan said that it was a tragic and pointless loss. But he would have been happy, well, not happy exactly, but satisfied, they agreed, that he had been at least partly in control of the circumstances of his death. And that the fall that killed him had lasted for only 1.5 seconds. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, you lucky thing. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do it at ko-fi.com/neurotic literature, or better still, by telling everyone you know about it. There is also a growing back catalogue of previous episodes which you can explore if you haven't already, or, let's be honest, even if you have. They're really good, you know.